I guess as advertised, my talk tonight is called Reruns, Clipshows, and Compilation Episodes, Reusing Content with Web Components. Is there anyone in here who's a content producer? I'm sorry, it's not that kind of content. Should have chosen my words more carefully. All right, aside from what Rick said, a bit about me. I've lost my slides. Oh, about me. My name is Buckley. Probably said that more than enough. My employer is Australia Post. Yeah, we got called out a bunch there in the last talk. My role is, I guess as Rick pointed out, the oldest front-end dev. My superpower is being able to sleep through any alarm clock. Unbelievable. And online, I'm a Mind United. I just fixed the spelling of that during his professionalism. All right, so tonight's talk is brought to you by componentsConf, which you may have heard of, also from before. componentsConf is on the 9th and 10th of September. There's a workshop day on the 9th. We have tons of incredible workshops. And on the 10th, we have so many amazing speakers, 2 streams, talking about all JavaScript libraries and frameworks and the intersection of how they work together. A great place to go and sort of check out the ones you're not using or learn new features in the ones you are. So we will continue with tonight's episode. We have had a word from our sponsors. So just to catch up, in the previous episodes of Web Components, if you weren't here for those, they didn't happen here, it's okay. So what are Web Components? I will explain. Web Components are HTML elements, by which I mean, this isn't, I just told this from Mozilla. So if you look at this drop-down, someone just put a little select and they put a couple of tags, say option in there, and the browser's put in this little shadow root and these slots and stuff. The browser's just kind of injected that for you. It's made decisions for you. How dare it? And that's essentially a web component. That's just a browser native one. And we can, by the end of this talk, we can make our own or decide not to, whichever. An input element is a slightly simpler one. You can see here we have the shadow root, and then we have this little div inside. Nobody created that div. Someone put input, and then the shadow root was added with this little div inside. And the reason for that is when you enter your name, this is my name, yours is different. But it gets, the content will just get injected into this little div slot. Web components have these lifecycle methods. I'm going to try and move quickly through these so we can get on to the rest of the episode. So this is just a plain web component. It's got the 4 callbacks: the connected callback, which is when it's added to the DOM; the disconnected callback, which is, bear with me here, when it's removed from the DOM; the adapted callback, which is for when it's moved to a new document. I don't understand this. I never used it. And the attribute changed callback. Now, if you set an array of observed attributes, the array needs to be called observed attributes, you can give it little custom attributes. Like if you've ever set an HTML element and given it like widths, it's an attribute. So you can set specific ones for it to observe and react to these changes. I'm sorry, can I use React? Is that a loaded word now? This isn't the simplest web component code. It could be a bit simpler, but this one gets constructed. We create the little shadow. You remember the shadow? And then I've created a little render function. So when it gets attached, we call a render function. I feel like that's familiar from somewhere. Doesn't matter. What I do is I create a document fragment that gives me a chance to create the DOM sort of off away from the browser, so we're not getting a whole bunch of action in the browser and jank, technical term. Then I create a container element, and the reason I do that is that document fragments don't really have all the same features as an element. So I just dump everything into this element that's just happening virtually. Throw that into the fragment, throw the fragment into the shadow. That's line by line, almost. And then we have a web component that just gets the whole chunk of it. You'd probably write more than here's some text. I don't think you'd need it if you... It does say he's some text. Look at him. He's some good text. Let me just get in there and edit my slides while I'm up on stage. So, the shadow part of the shadow DOM, where that little slot was, where the name gets populated in the input field. This here, I've just put a little tag called slot here. And you can see we're generating some content above and some content below. And in the HTML, we just pass through whatever we want. It doesn't need to be a string. It can be a whole bunch of content. It can be div tags and whatever. But you can have content sort of sandwiched in there. There's more features like name slots and stuff, but we're not getting into that because I was rushing my slides on the way here. Another thing that's coming up with web components is HTML modules. Coming to most browsers near you, if not already there on your browser, depending on how evergreen your browser is. HTML modules are a replacement for HTML templates, which were allowing us to just inject, use HTML chunks that were sort of out of there. So how these work is you can import them like you're importing JavaScript into your JavaScript, and then just use the HTML. And there might be a few of you out there that are trying to think of how you can use this to get around security and stuff. So I'm going to move to the next slide. And now a word from our sponsor. Our sponsor is not that ding message. So at componentsConf, on September 9th at 2 o'clock, we have a 4-hour workshop on Vue.js for women only, or people who identify as women. And as far as I'm concerned, are women. If you just go on our website, hit it and register, free 4-hour workshop on Vue. If you don't use Vue in your current work, it's probably a great way to start seeing what the advantages are or what it is to bring back into what you're currently working on. Cool. Back to our regularly scheduled program. All right. Web components seem cool. However, there are the critics. Does anyone remember this show? I'm like the only person, right? Yes. Also, that S, how smooth is that? Added it myself. Seamless. Seamless. Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to tick through some of the criticisms. Web components don't work for progressive enhancement. If you don't know progressive enhancement, the concept is your website should work just by default, like even without JavaScript. If it's a form, a page of content, whatever, it should just work in raw HTML. And then anything that JavaScript does should enrich that experience, be building on top of it. And since web components are written in JavaScript that needs to run on the page, the argument is, how do you do progressive enhancement? Another argument is platform fatigue. We've had a lot of different, actually a poor example, we've had way more JavaScript libraries and frameworks just poured on us. And a lot of people are sort of exhausted with learning new ones or trying to keep up with it. The flash of unstyled content. I feel like this was a big thing a while ago, and we've stopped worrying about it because it's not really happening on our site. On my site, I don't know what's happening on anyone else's. The flash of unstyled content is when an element renders on the page, but it doesn't have all of its styles yet, and it gets kind of janky. And then that's my interpretive dance of what it's like. The elements sort of come up and then move into place as the styles get applied. This has happened from the style sheet loading sort of slower or dynamically. And if you create your web component so that you attach a link tag to a script, to a style, it's going to be loading that style after it's rendered. So you're going to get some jank. Polyfills. There'll be some older browsers out there, and in order to support web components in them, you're going to have to shove in some polyfills, which is extra code and extra overhead. And since the whole idea of using web components is to use browser native technology, adding polyfills to use browser native technology does feel a little icky. Composition. This I thought was an interesting one. The issue that if you're using a library or a framework, you can put an element on the page and say, I don't want you to render yet, and it won't. If you do that with a web component and it has any image links or script tags or CSS links, it's going to start pulling them in because it's on the page. And it thinks that that's what you want, which makes lazy loading a little awkward. This is another one that I'm confused about this confusion. But I have seen in a couple of articles that it wasn't clear what the difference between props and attributes were in web components, and they've sort of muddied that water, and there's an old man yelling at the sky gif that I really should have in here. But I don't. And of course, the use of the global namespace, because web components need to be declared in the browser that you're in yeah, I guess, or else your site's not going to work. In the context that you're in, you're assigning all of these names, and that name is then taken. And if you start doing it all in different places in your code, you might end up with namespace conflicts. I'd like to go through a bit of a clip show now. We go back through these. In response to these criticisms, progressive enhancement. This is Facebook. They created React. They've provided us with so many tools for server-side rendering, and the thing is, there is some working parts of that site. There are some working parts of that site, so they have some progressive enhancement in there. I highly encourage all efforts toward it, but it's not delighting to the customer. And most of the features that they want, honestly, if you just run a website and you don't have any analytics, your team is going to get squeezed out of the business, I'm pretty sure. I'd love to not do analytics, but they require JavaScript, and that's what I get paid for. Platform fatigue. I've tried really subtly to highlight here every one of these frameworks or libraries that I have used and know work with web components. The other ones are just ones I haven't used. I'm pretty sure that they all will work with web components. And that's the thing about the platform fatigue, is that these are just native JavaScript elements, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. If you're exhausted with all these new libraries that you're learning, or having to go back and work with an old library and remember or find out how that worked, using web components means that you don't have to have that massive overhead of learning the whole framework or library. You can get in there and then progressively learn it. It's like progressive enhancement for developers. I wish I thought of that ahead of time. The flash of unstyled content. Yeah, this one, you can style your web components however you want. And both of the articles that I read that pulled out the flash of unstyled content were encouraging you to put your styles into web components in links that pulled the styles in. So you were going to get jank. But you can use CSS modules, you can use global CSS, you can pull in CSS as a string and just write it in, which I will show later. And that solves that. Just solved. The polyfills. The polyfills only are really needed at this point for Internet Explorer and my mom's old iPhone, but it was her birthday last week, so that thing's dead. So for the ES5 adapter, 942 bytes. I think your app can take it. And 110K for the Web Components bundle. And you can just load this before you bootstrap your app if you feel like you need it ahead of time. Or not, just don't support IE 11 users. The ideal world. Composition, rendering them to the page, whether or not. Well, rendering them to the page on a conditional, and lazy loading. Now, I'm not saying that we web components all the things. I still think that the libraries and frameworks that we're using are kind of essential to our work. There's so much extra stuff that's going on in React and Angular and Vue and Ember, and I won't keep going. But you can just use your library or framework to wrap around the web component and say, don't render till I need you. Problem solved. The other thing is, if you wanted to just do it in web components, you can have the web component hold on to its slotted content and render it when it's ready. Right? You can observe attributes. I mentioned that earlier. Okay, the confusion between props and attributes. I may have subtly mentioned before that I was confused by this confusion, but I'm going to solve this one. I'm going to solve it. Attributes are the little strings that you pass through. Width equals 200. Height equals, yeah? Properties are class properties. You call the class name dot property and pass it stuff. I don't know. If you were confused before, that's it. That's problem solved. The global namespace. How I've solved this was I had one file that does all of my imports. And if two things are named the same, I get a little red underliney magoo in my editor. It is squiggly. I get a little red squiggly underline. It's the custom elements are like a map, right? So you can rename these things at any point. And if you keep, how many, what are you gonna have, 1 million in your application? Like you can see what you have. I do strongly advise putting your definitions in a separate file, because that way you can see them all in front of you and you're not confused by all the other code that other people have written and how horrified you are that they used for each instead of map. Now for a commercial break. I've already done this. I just setting you up there. All right, so let's get on to the use case. componentsConf.com.au now. Ooh, all right, this is where it gets scary. One, I don't know which, I've lost my mouse. What is this one, the React app? Okay, I'm gonna spin this up. It's only on my screen. Nope. Nope. I will. Everything's gone bad. Yes, please do. Hey. Oh, it's replaced my slides. All right. We'll figure that out. Okay. So in this scenario, you might have been wondering why I was all TV themed at the beginning. I still am. So in this scenario, we have a business that it's just a website, and all it does is display recent television shows that somehow match the word React. I actually hit an API to get this, and this is the results. You can't make this stuff up. I feel like Halo's a video game. Anyway. All right, well, we can debate the decision-making process of the API with the API developers, of which I'm not one. Also, the next slide, which doesn't exist now, the Angular app, which kind of seems a bit similar. It allows you, well, first of all, it lists all the things with Star Trek in the name. It was just a good payload for me to use. I'm not condoning the use of Star Trek. And you can add stuff to the list. And it'll just keep building. Now, I don't know why our business managers have decided to run two separate apps. But if you've ever worked for a fairly large company, you probably know that you have seen at least two apps that were pretty much the same with a slightly different branding. So this is where we get into the use case. And lose my mouse again. Since I closed my slides expertly, does anyone remember where I was? Oh yeah, I was. Well done. I just use this browser for everything. Cool. And I've shown you the Angular app. Sharing. Now, since both of these apps are pretty much the same, and they're under the same branding, and the company's decided that we need to unify the look. I know it's fairly unified as it is, but I mean, I was just making this for a demo, so I'm not a designer. All right, so using web components in React. How am I doing for time?
How much more time do you want?
Getting thirsty. All right. Ooh. So, where are we? Oh, good. I'm not going to do that again. Pop out of that. All right. So, using the web components in React, I'm going straight into the code. Oh, you cannot see that. Maybe you can, and I just have terrible vision. All right. So here's that little custom elements file that I set up before. I put my define custom elements in a little function that I can call. This is something I learned from trying to get it to run in Angular. Needed to take a moment and say, no, I'm ready for you guys to define yourselves. So aside from that, React is really easy, I mean, in general, but to get web components working. You define them and then you include them in your JSX. That is it. It is no-brainery. If I have a look at, I'll go to the list page. I think that's where that was. Components, this page. This page. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a web component that wraps around images. I may have prepared this earlier. There. You can see as the image loads, my network is too fast. As the image loads, there's a small loading image. I thought we're in Australia, the internet would have been slow enough as it was. Let's, where am I? Where am I? Where am I? What am I doing here? All right. No, that's Australian speed. All right.
Okay, now you're running out of time.
All right. Hey! All right. So they've decided they want this loading animation everywhere. So I injected it into the React app. That's all I did. Was I just changed image to image wrap, and I've got a little image wrap web component. It's here. I called it image wrap. Yeah. So I've taken the same web component and I moved it over into the Angular app. NGTV is our company name. We're looking for investors, so if anyone wants to throw money at us. I've declared custom elements with the exact same file. I copied and pasted it. I'm sure you get the idea. And list page. I've named list page slightly differently because Angular. All right, so because I was worried that I might be running out of time by Rick standards, I made this commentable. I can see. Hey! Angular was actually a bit more difficult, which is funny because they've been promoting themselves as allowing you to compile their components into web components for a while now, and they're really hyped about it. But it turns out they're not too hyped about going the other way. So in Angular, I needed to declare that I was going to use custom elements, and by importing the custom element schema, and I needed to manually bootstrap the application so that I could declare the custom elements first. Probably added an extra 10 minutes to my development time. It was pretty rough. It was pretty rough. I have more. We have the header and footer and stuff, but I think you guys seem pretty sharp. So we'll just skip ahead of that. I don't think I've said enough bad things about web components, so Gatsby. Any Gatsby fans here? Woo! Oh, calm down, guys. Gatsby, the way that it renders on the server side, I tried every DOM library out there, and the best thing to do was to hack my Webpack config to return nothing when it requests a web component. That way, server side, you render your whole React app, Gatsby app, and client side, they get the enhancements. That a bit disappointed with that. But I do think in the near future, using the Gatsby Node.js module, we'll be able to inject in a virtual, like a JS DOM or something to polyfill this. But I think we're probably a few months away from it, looking at how much I was willing to work on it. I really felt like a murderer there, hacking my elements to not return anything. Testing Jest is not super fun either, but Salesforce, surprisingly, have put together a library for loading their Lightning components, which does not seem to require too much hacking to get it to work with legitimate web components. So that's cool. Easy jesting sometime soon. Or if you're working for Salesforce, I'm sorry. Cypress, because that's how we do all our end-to-end testing, works out of the box. It just works because it uses headless Chrome. So it renders in a browser. Chimaka and Jasmine, you can just mock the global object. Use JS DOM. Your tests are going to run mildly slower, but you're probably eating Doritos while it happens anyway, so you're happy. Accessibility. ARIA tags just work. They pass through. The browser will grab them. So in fact, web components kind of make it a lot better for accessibility because someone can just plonk it in. And sometimes when you have, particularly with Angular JS before and Ember version 1, ARIA tags would, for some reason, come out mangled sometimes unless you added another library. And but no, with web components, they seem to, as far as my experience has gone, they seem to just work pretty well. And you can just package them, just put them in there, and the next developer doesn't need to worry about it. So really, I don't think that web components are going to replace our framework wars. We can keep fighting over what framework we think is best. Web components are like these, web components are just another part of the native element that we can start plugging in. At least, I mean, where I work, Australia Post, we have several teams working with different libraries. And they need to kind of share the same branding and being able to say, okay, well, here's a button or an image loader that has our branding on it. So you can just use that and they can continue using the framework around it without any, without any struggle. I spent a long time on this slide and then rewrote my whole presentation, and I just kind of left it in there because I wasted so much time on this. I've got to make better decisions in my life. Anyway, that's all from me and web components. Thank you.
Get back!